Long before the marble halls of Oldway Mansion were even imagined, Isaac Merritt Singer lived a life that looked nothing like the beginning of an industrial empire. In the 1930s, his world was not factories or machines. It was wooden stages, traveling theater troupes, and dusty American towns where actors performed by lantern light. Singer was a performer, loud, charismatic, and restless. Night after night he stood beneath flickering oil lamps, delivering dramatic lines to small crowds, chasing applause and the fragile promise of success. But theater paid poorly, and stability was almost impossible to find. Between performances, Singer began taking small mechanical jobs. Workshops in cities like New York and Boston were filled with the noise of metal tools striking iron frames, the smell of machine oil, and the constant grinding of gears being filed and reshaped by hand. These shops repaired everything from printing presses to factory equipment. It was messy, loud work, but Singer discovered something important there. He had a natural talent for machines. The mid-19th century was the height of industrial experimentation. Inventors across Europe and America were trying to solve the same problem: how to build a practical sewing machine. Several early versions already existed, but most were unreliable. Needles snapped, threads tangled, mechanisms jammed after only a few minutes of work. Inside cramped workshops cluttered with metal parts and half-finished machines, Singer began studying these designs. He wasn't the first to imagine a sewing machine, but he could see exactly why the existing ones kept failing. One evening, surrounded by scattered tools and iron components on a workbench, he began experimenting with improvements. The machine needed a stronger vertical needle, a more stable presser foot, a smoother motion that could guide fabric through the mechanism without constant jams. Metal clicked against metal as Singer adjusted gears and linkages. The workshop echoed with the sharp tapping of files against steel. Slowly, a new design began to take shape. When the machine finally ran smoothly, the difference was obvious. The needle moved quickly and consistently. The cloth slid beneath the foot in a steady rhythm. Instead of stopping every few stitches, the machine could run continuously, producing clean, reliable seams at a speed no human seamstress could match. What Singer had created wasn't just another experiment. It was the first sewing machine that ordinary people could actually use. And that small mechanical improvement, built in a noisy workshop among scattered iron parts, was about to change homes and factories across the world. But inventing the machine was only the beginning, because the real revolution would start when Singer discovered how to build thousands of them at once. By the early 1850s, the small mechanical experiment inside Singer's workshop had begun to transform into something much larger. Inside newly organized factories, the atmosphere was completely different from the quiet repair shops where the first prototype had been built. The air was thick with the smell of machine oil and hot metal. Long rows of iron frames stood across wooden floors while workers tightened bolts, aligned gears, and tested moving parts. Every few seconds, the steady rhythm of machinery echoed through the building. Clank, turn, stitch. The Singer sewing machine was no longer just an invention. It had become a product. Heavy cast-iron bodies were molded and polished. Steel needles were fitted carefully into moving arms. Each machine was assembled piece by piece until the mechanism moved smoothly, guiding fabric beneath its metal foot with a steady mechanical rhythm. But Singer understood something many inventors never did. Building a machine was only half the battle. Selling it to the world was the real challenge. At the time, most working families could never afford a complex mechanical device. A sewing machine was expensive, far beyond the reach of ordinary households that still stitched clothing by hand. So Singer introduced something radical. Instead of forcing customers to pay the full price up front, the company offered machines through installment payments. Families could take a machine home and pay for it slowly over time. It was a simple idea, but it changed everything. Suddenly, the sewing machine was no longer a luxury item reserved for factories or wealthy households. It became a tool that ordinary people could own. In cities and towns across America and Europe, the quiet tapping of hand needles began to disappear, replaced by the faster, confident rhythm of the Singer machine. Inside homes, the sound was unmistakable. The steady click of the needle, the turning wheel guiding the thread, the fabric sliding forward as stitches formed in perfect lines. Clothes that once took days to sew could now be finished in hours. Demand exploded. Factories expanded. Production lines grew longer. Crates filled with machines were loaded onto trains and ships, traveling across oceans toward Europe, South America, and beyond. The Singer name began to appear in shop windows in cities thousands of miles apart. Within just a few years, Isaac Singer had gone from a struggling mechanic to one of the most powerful industrialists of the 19th century. The sewing machine had entered the world's homes. But while the business empire was growing with remarkable precision, Singer's personal life was becoming far more complicated. And unlike the machines in his factories, the chaos that followed would be far harder to control. As the Singer Sewing Machine Company expanded across continents, the life of its founder was becoming something far more difficult to manage than a factory. Inside Singer's workshops, everything had a system. Metal parts arrived on schedule. Workers assembled machines in precise order. Gears turned exactly as they were designed to. But outside those factories, Singer's life lived by very different rules. Throughout the 1850s and 1860s, while Singer machines were entering homes across America and Europe, Singer himself was building something far less organized, an enormous and complicated family network that stretched across several cities and several households at once. Victorian society expected wealthy industrialists to maintain a respectable image. Public reputation mattered. Family life was supposed to appear orderly and disciplined. Singer's life was anything but. He formed relationships with multiple women over the years, sometimes maintaining separate households at the same time. In New York, in Paris, and in other cities connected to his growing business empire, children were being born into different branches of what was becoming one of the most unusual families of the industrial age. By the time the situation fully revealed itself, Singer had fathered more than 20 children. The quiet rhythm of the sewing machine had built a fortune, but the man behind it seemed unable to apply the same order to his personal life. Newspapers began whispering about the situation. Legal disputes appeared. Questions about inheritance started circulating long before Singer himself had even begun thinking about the end of his life. The problem wasn't just scandal, it was mathematics. An industrial fortune could support a family dynasty, but when that dynasty suddenly included dozens of heirs, the future of the empire itself became uncertain. Singer understood the danger, and as the attention surrounding his private life grew louder in America, he made a decision that surprised many people around him. He would leave. Quietly and with enormous wealth already secured, Isaac Merritt Singer began shifting his life across the Atlantic Ocean. His destination would be a quiet coastal town in England, and on a hill overlooking the sea, he would begin building something that seemed designed for a royal family, a palace that could hold an entire dynasty. But even that palace would not be large enough to contain the legacy he had created. By the early 1870s, Isaac Merritt Singer had left much of the noise of American scandal behind him. Across the Atlantic, on the southern coast of England, he found a quieter place to rebuild the image of his life. The town was Torquay, a calm seaside community overlooking the deep blue waters of the English Channel. Gentle sea winds moved through the hills, and elegant Victorian houses lined the coastline. It was a place where wealthy families came to escape the chaos of the growing industrial cities. But Singer had something much grander in mind. High above the town, on a hillside with a clear view of the ocean, construction crews began clearing land for a project that would quickly become the largest private residence in the region. Day after day, wagons delivered stone, marble, and timber up the winding road. Workers climbed wooden scaffolding as iron hammers struck against beams and pillars. The sounds of construction echoed across the hillside as the structure slowly rose into view. This would become Oldway Mansion. Singer didn't want a simple English estate. He wanted a palace, something that reflected the immense fortune he had built through the sewing machine empire. The architecture drew inspiration from the grand style of European aristocracy. Wide terraces overlooked the gardens below. Marble staircases climbed between floors. Large windows opened toward the sea, allowing sunlight to flood the halls during the long English afternoons. Inside, polished wood floors stretched through enormous rooms designed for entertaining guests, hosting gatherings, and displaying the wealth of the industrial age. But Oldway Mansion was not only a home, it was a symbol. Singer had built one of the most successful manufacturing companies in the world. His machines had transformed domestic life, bringing industrial efficiency into millions of homes. And now, overlooking the quiet English coast, he had created a residence that matched the scale of his empire. From the balconies of the mansion, the view stretched across Torquay and out toward the open sea. It looked like the perfect setting for the head of a vast and powerful family dynasty. Yet behind the elegance of the marble halls and sea-facing terraces, a question still remained unresolved. Because the empire that paid for this palace had already produced dozens of heirs, and the future of that inheritance was about to become far more complicated than the machines that had built the fortune in the first place. From the outside, Oldway Mansion looked like the perfect symbol of industrial success. Its terraces overlooked the sea. Marble columns framed the entrance. Guests arriving by carriage passed through wide gardens before stepping into halls designed to impress anyone who crossed the threshold. But behind those walls, a quiet problem was beginning to grow. The same empire that had built the mansion had also created a family far larger than anyone in Victorian society expected. By the time Isaac Merritt Singer settled in England, the number of his children had already become difficult to track without careful records. Sons and daughters had been born into several different households over many years, each with their own mothers, their own upbringing, and their own future expectations. And every one of them was technically connected to one of the largest industrial fortunes of the 19th century. In factories across Europe and America, Singer's sewing machines were being assembled by the thousands. Iron frames moved through production lines. Needles clicked through cloth in homes and workshops around the world. The company continued to grow stronger every year. But a business empire and a family dynasty operate by very different rules. Factories can be organized. Machines can be designed to move in perfect rhythm. Families rarely follow such precise patterns. Lawyers began studying documents and drafting complicated agreements. Property records were examined. Financial accounts were carefully divided and described in legal language that attempted to bring order to something that had never truly been organized from the beginning. The question was simple: who would inherit the empire? Would one branch of the family take control of the fortune? Would the wealth be divided among dozens of heirs? And if it were divided, could the company that built the fortune remain stable? Singer himself continued living in the mansion overlooking Torquay, surrounded by the comforts that his machines had made possible. But the quiet discussions happening around his estate suggested that the real challenge of his empire had not yet begun. Because the machines had built the fortune, now the heirs would have to decide what to do with it. In the summer of 1875, the man who had turned a small mechanical improvement into a global industry finally reached the end of his story. Inside Oldway Mansion, overlooking the calm waters of the English Channel, Isaac Merritt Singer died at the age of 64. The machines that carried his name were still being built in factories across the world. Steel needles continued rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Cast iron frames left workshops in endless rows, packed into crates and shipped across oceans. But the man who had controlled that growing empire was suddenly gone. And the enormous fortune he left behind quickly revealed just how complicated his legacy had become. At the time of his death, Singer's estate was one of the largest private fortunes of the industrial era. The sewing machine had become an essential tool for households and workshops everywhere. Singer machines were already spreading through Europe, Russia, and South America, creating one of the first truly global consumer brands. Yet the wealth that flowed from those machines now had to be divided among a family unlike almost any other in Victorian society. With more than 20 children connected to the Singer name, lawyers faced the enormous task of organizing the inheritance. Documents were examined, financial claims were evaluated, and complex arrangements were drafted to distribute property, investments, and control of the estate. The process took years. The empire itself continued operating. The Singer Sewing Machine Company expanded even further, building massive factories and opening showrooms in cities around the world. The steady rhythm of the machines never stopped. But the fortune behind the company no longer belonged to a single powerful figure. Instead, it flowed outward into many branches of the Singer family, spreading the wealth of the industrial age across generations of heirs who had grown up in very different households. And high above the English coastline, Oldway Mansion remained where Singer had left it, standing quietly on the hill as the dynasty he imagined began to evolve into something far more complicated than he could have planned. Today, the hill above Torquay is far quieter than it was in the 19th century. The sound of construction hammers that once echoed across the hillside is gone. The wagons that carried marble and timber up the narrow road disappeared long ago. And the man who built the palace that overlooks the town has been gone for more than a century. But Oldway Mansion still stands. Its grand terraces, wide staircases, and sea-facing windows remain a reminder of the moment when industrial wealth was powerful enough to build palaces in quiet corners of Europe. The mansion has changed roles many times over the years, used as a private residence, later as a municipal building, and occasionally open to visitors curious about the story behind its walls. Yet the building still carries the atmosphere of the Victorian era that created it. Walking through its halls today, you can still see the scale of the ambition that shaped it. Long corridors stretch beneath high ceilings. Stone balconies look out over the gardens. Sunlight filters through tall windows, just as it did when the sewing machine king first arrived in England with his enormous fortune. But the dynasty that mansion was meant to represent never truly formed. The Singer fortune spread outward through generations of descendants. Some branches of the family continued living comfortably for decades. Others faded quietly into ordinary life. Meanwhile, the company that had built the empire kept evolving, growing far beyond the man who first helped perfect the machine. Singer sewing machines continued appearing in homes, factories, and workshops across the world. And the mansion, built to symbolize the height of that success, slowly became something else. A historical monument to a moment when industry, wealth, and personal ambition collided in extraordinary ways. The palace remained, but the empire that built it no longer belonged to a single name. In the end, the empire Isaac Merritt Singer helped build did exactly what the machines in his factories were designed to do. It kept moving. Long after the man himself was gone, the steady rhythm of the sewing machine continued shaping everyday life across the world. In homes, workshops, and clothing factories, the familiar clicking of the needle became part of the background sound of modern industry. A simple household tool had quietly changed how people worked, how clothes were made, and how entire industries functioned. Singer's fortune helped create one of the earliest global consumer brands, spreading mechanical innovation into millions of households during the industrial age. But the palace he built above the English coast tells a different side of that story. Oldway Mansion was meant to symbolize permanence, wealth solid enough to last for generations, a home large enough to hold an entire dynasty. Yet the family it was meant to anchor became too large and too complex to remain unified under a single legacy. The empire survived, the mansion survived, but the dynasty itself scattered across time. Today, Oldway Mansion still stands on the hill above Torquay, watching quietly over the town below. Its terraces face the sea, just as they did when the sewing machine king first arrived with his enormous fortune and a vision of the future. It remains a monument not just to industrial success, but to the complicated human stories that often hide behind it. Because the Singer Mansion was not the only palace built during the industrial age where wealth and legacy collided. Across Europe and America, many fortunes created homes just as grand and families just as complicated. And some of those mansions are still standing today, waiting for someone to uncover the stories they hold.